You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Now, the horsemeat scandal runs on, and now the British government is criticising retailers for not telling consumers quickly enough about how much horsemeat is in their processed beef products. So is this a question of greedy supermarkets, or is it an international food mafia defrauding the world, selling beef that's actually horse? Joining the discussion is Professor Mike Lean, who's Head of Human Nutrition at the University of Glasgow and one of the world's leading nutritionalists. Andrew Webb is a food journalist and editor of lovefood.com. Rob Lyons is Deputy Editor of Spiked and a food writer. And Nick Andrews is a burger lover, reviewer and blogger for hamburgerme.com. First of all then, Professor Lean, is this a question of greedy supermarkets, or is there a bigger, wider issue of international fraud, which has meant that consumers in Britain no longer know whether it's horse lasagna or beef lasagna?
I think the food industry internationally, worldwide, has always been greedy when that industry has gone one step removed from the consumer. So if you have food made by a farmer and sold directly to a customer in the village, then you don't have a lot of capacity for fraud. There isn't much scope for fraud there. You can go back, hundreds of years. Fraudulent adulteration of foods of various kinds have hundreds of years of history. Milk was one of the earliest foods to be adulterated, just being watered down and sometimes coloured with chalk to be able to sell it at the price of milk when actually you're selling water. And the same applies to currently foods like orange juice internationally, olive oil internationally. Colossal problems with adulteration and fraud. The meat story is interesting because you can't really sell fresh meat because customers would see what it was, but you can sell processed meat. And if you can sell processed meat, then firstly you're selling meat that people wouldn't eat normally. It's usually very poor quality. Processed meat, things like sausages, pies, pâtés, generally are the parts of meat, parts of an animal, if you like, which you wouldn't normally buy and eat. They're the leftovers. They're, to some extent, industrial waste. And it's being sold again, sometimes at quite high prices. And the profit margins, though, in the food industry are all pretty low, and it's almost inevitable that someone somewhere will start to say, hello, I can chuck a bit of horse in here, or a bit of dog or cat or camel or badger or something, and get away with it, because it's very difficult for other people to recognize this. It's taken science to get to the point where we're doing DNA testing on foods to be able to identify what is actually in these foods. And we've known for quite some years that there has been leftover bits of pork or pig, should we say, put into burgers, and of chicken and turkey. This has been known for some time, but people have assumed that because we commonly eat turkey or pig and pork, it doesn't matter very much if it goes into a burger. My concern there is that it's usually very poor quality bits of those other animals which are put into burgers, things which we wouldn't normally be eating. The problem with horse, certainly in Britain, is that horse is not normally eaten, and the potential is there to put in not just horse meat, but other bits of horses, heaven knows which bits, and certainly they're not all being slaughtered for human consumption, so they're not using normal hygiene processes, and they may involve diseased, sick, old animals.
Professor Lean, what's your biggest concern with this, for want of a better word, the horse meat scandal in Britain? Your biggest concern as a nutritionalist?
I'm concerned. I've been concerned about processed meat products for many years, because that's a way of concealing very poor quality, very high fat products, which are often flavoured up with a lot of salt and by and large are very bad for health in a lot of different ways. The fraudulent use of other meats is simply that. It's fraud. It's a criminal activity. And I suppose I have to come from the health angle to say, because we don't know exactly what's gone into these burgers and lasagnas, we can't say for certain that it is safe for human consumption. Now, horse meat, properly prepared in a country where horse meat is normally eaten, is prepared in a way which is perfectly safe. But we don't know what's gone into these. And the very complicated supply chain means that it could well include animals which were not fit for human consumption.
Thank you, Professor Mike Lean. And now I'm going to come to you, Andrew Webb, food journalist and editor of lovefood.com. Is this a question of the greedy supermarkets, or, as we've just discussed, the international fraud agenda? I mean, who's to blame?
I think at the moment everyone's playing past the parcel with the blame, and the music's still going. We've got everybody from, the Environment Secretary, the FSA. I think This is basically the Leveson for the food industry, and the FSA is in danger of being like the Press Complaints Commission and just going to dissolve itself out of existence. The game's still in spin at the moment. No one quite knows, but it's just, you couldn't write it. It's like a James Bond thriller. We've got government forces, we've got mafia in Romanian things, we've got stuff coming from all over the world. This is the next Bond, I think. It's just such a perfect storm on the back of the credit crunch and cheap food, and everything's come to one great big giant mess.
I agree. This story has captured everyone on so many levels and so many angles. And it does bring up the big debates as to how powerful the supermarkets are. Is this a reaction to the recession and cheap food? And do consumers have a responsibility? Because they are the very ones who want the processed food, which people like Professor Lean have campaigned to sort of change buying because that processed food is not healthy.
Processed food forms a large part of some people's diets, and the amount we're all spending on food is going less and less. So you go back sort of 50 years, it was sort of 25-30%. Now it's under 10. We're spending more on gadgets and television subscriptions than we are on food. Yes, that's part of the problem. I think that the retailers have got questions to answer. If I was going to have the book stop anywhere, it would be there. And I don't think that buyer beware is a good enough defence, really. I think we need shorter supply chains, because this is the problem. A local butcher will have 3 people in his supply chain, the abattoir and then the farmer beyond him, and he will know all 3. And that's as short as a supply chain can really be. It's when you get to these things, I mean, unravelling it all, it's like spaghetti. It's kind of, it's going all over here. It's brokers here. It's people on yachts in dark sunglasses, moving horses around. It's just an absolute crazy mess.
Every part of that, they have their own margins, and so there's a marginal game. Every time you have a producer and then an agent and then a meat packer and then a distributor, suddenly you're looking at another margin. So it's every reason to put cheaper meat into the product.
Mm. I think there's something here about the sort of the banning of de-sinewed meat as well. So that's a key issue. When that was mechanically separated meat in these sorts of ways of basically stripping off a tiny flecks of meat from a carcass with jets and crushers and things. When that was banned, it was like, how do we have all this cheap food? And that was the way that they kind of, they still have these quotas to fulfil. It's all done on price. And I think it's interesting that the sort of foods that this has turned up in, it's turned up in, spaghetti bolognese, which is not an expensive meal to make. Tesco's value spaghetti is 30p, a can of tomatoes, an onion, and then some, mince from the butcher's counter even. It's not, will we see it in like things like cottage pies and more, it's strange that it's all in this sort of Italian thing.
Well, I mean, lasagna is, one of the nation's favourite ready meals. Rob, I'll come to you, Deputy Editor of Spiked and author of Panic on a Plate. Now, you mentioned that there needs to be a different discussion about this horse meat scandal. It's not just I don't eat processed food, doesn't affect me, isn't this awful, what's been going on? What would you like to hear?
Well, I think that one of the things that's happening is I think it's very simple and easy to just blame the industry and say, oh, it's because they're greedy and whatever. Of course, like any other organisation, especially when we're dealing with commodity foods that everything's down, the profit margins are small on. There's pressures on supply and whatever. But actually, I think in this instance, I think that what we're seeing is a combination of fraud and people just not thinking that anybody would put horse meat into beef, and it just came slightly out of left field. Why would somebody do that, and where did all this horse meat come from all of a sudden? I think that people have been blindsided by that, and I think that the comments have been made about supply chains. There's a certain amount of truth in that, but what's happened is a tick box culture has been created, whereby you say we won't check specifically ourselves. What we'll do is, well, we've got the paperwork. The paperwork says it's okay. That we've met the regulations, so that's okay. And actually, the problem is once you have more and more regulations, then not only do the consumers then rely on the fact that the law is regulating these things, but actually the companies start to regulate rather than actually checking things out for themselves. And I think they've been caught with their pants down on this one, and I think that they'll be looking at changing their systems. It's interestingly, Morrison's has made a big deal out about the fact that they have much better control, much more direct relationships with their farmers, as do McDonald's in the UK. And I think it'd be interesting to see if people like Tesco's are now going to go down that route as well.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare, where we're discussing the latest revelations in the horsemeat scandal. I'm joined by Professor Mike Lean, head of the Human Nutrition Department at the University of Glasgow. Nick Andrews, a burger lover, reviewer and blogger. Rob Lyons, deputy editor of Spiked and a food writer. And Andrew Webb, a food journalist and editor of lovefood.com.
I think there's something interesting here about regulation, because the knee-jerk reaction is like, right, more regulation. And the regulations that we've got in place now around beef are quite strict about moving animals. This is post-BSE. If you've ever seen a cow's passport, it's about this big. It's more complex than a human's passport. They are chipped. You cannot move a cow from one field to the other and then move it back again. It has to wait a week there. All post-BSE, we had this massive influx of regulation. And then what's happened is that we have got very light regulation on horses. And so, a bit like wars, you always prepare for the last crisis that's happened. So now we're going to have a massive load of knee-jerk reactions to chuck on a load of horse regulation. And then, lo and behold, it'll be someone else turning up. But you can see why this has kind of happened. According to the Ulster Society Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, 70,000 horses have kind of gone missing from Northern Ireland. Where's all this stuff gone? It just you can buy an old nag for €10, kill it and skin it and sell it for 500 into the food chain. The temptation is just too great there for people to try and make a buck. Animal rustling has happened. 1,400 sheep got stolen in Lincolnshire a couple of months ago. It's a crazy cowboy culture.
But that's why this story is so interesting, because it throws up so many other angles of what is actually happening in the world that we live in. And I spoke to someone from a slaughterhouse who said that he believed that there is this criminal mafia who has done this defrauding, and that they are flogging dead horses off as beef knowingly.
Yeah.
And the problem is now is we don't know what's in these horses, which has entered the food chain.
The trouble is that people will inspect the paperwork, not the product, and that's what happened. If you took a horse carcass to a butcher, he'd be like, "What the hell's this?" But when it's ground up in a box, in a tub, wrapped in cellophane, on a pallet truck, in a warehouse, up a flight of, it's just completely removed, and they're just like Rob says, it's like tick tick tick, and that's how we've got to this point.
Nick, do you think this is going to change the way people eat burgers, processed food? You're a burger expert. I've seen in the last couple of years since I've been reviewing the explosion of burgers that has been happening in London, not least the UK. I've seen there's been a real flight to quality in terms of passionate chefs and restaurateurs knowing the farm, where their beef has come from, knowing their butcher, and actually sourcing really, really good beef. And, I think people are willing to pay a premium for that, certainly in the eating out space. And I don't think that's going to change. You'll still get your, chain pub burgers, which are frozen and which, say they're 100% beef. Whether they're not or whether they are or not is a different matter. But I think actually there's been a real movement away from the sort of process side of things towards quality aged and well-reared, well-sourced beef. Professor Lean.
Yes, the word today is that sales of fresh Scottish beef, which we know to be safe, have increased by around 30% from the butchers, and they're sort of rubbing hands together. And that makes the point. But I'm quite interested to know, and I don't know this, whether people are reverting to Scottish beef that they can trace and they know its origin, they know it's safe, because they don't like the idea of eating horse, or is it because that they were concerned about the unknown health risks of eating a product whose composition nobody seems to know? And I suspect this probably is the fear of the unknown. And the spectre of BSE and this ghastly issue, that was another instance where in the pursuit of greater profits, greater yield, feeding ground up sheep's brains to cattle, which happened internationally, led to this terrible upsurge of a colossally new disease which could be passed on to humans and only years after you've eaten the stuff. This is a ghastly thing to have happened. And of course, in principle, since we don't know what's in these burgers, we know there's some horse, but we don't know what bit. That type of ghastly scenario could actually arise again, and that, I think, is in the back of the minds of most consumers. And when we go to the butcher, as our parents did, or perhaps I still do, go to the village butcher and buy a piece of meat because I know what it is, and I can speak to the butcher about exactly where it came from and how he's looked after it in the meantime. There is an immense trust that that is completely given there. You don't have to. There are no unknowns.
Andrew Webb.
The one problem with the traditional butcher, and this is mirrored in, at the same time we're seeing the death of the high street and all this sort of stuff, is that they have early 20th century opening hours when we live in the 21st century, and it's great that everyone's trying to make a bit of effort now, but it just doesn't wash long scale. Butchers, they close at 2 o'clock on a Saturday and they're shut on Sunday. When's the time when everyone has time to cook and go out and buy a big bit of meat? They won't make a sustainable living selling a little bit of stewing steak to an old lady for a cat Monday to Friday. I think if butchers want to capitalise on this, and it's great that people are going back there and the traceability and the sales are up, they need to rethink their business model. Close Monday, Tuesday, and be there at the weekends when people have got time to cook.
But
absolutely.
Our consumers need to make some changes as well. This idea that people should eat meat or meat products virtually every day of the week is not traditional. It's not the way that human beings survived through evolution. It's kind of been led by, I guess, the American market, where meat consumption or meat product consumption is roughly double what we have in the UK and Europe. But if you don't have to go very far away to France or Italy to find whole populations where meat is a very highly prized commodity, which is eaten on high days and holidays, and is respected in a way which I think we've lost. So I think there's a coming together here where the butchers do need to listen to their consumers a bit more and not just capitalise on a flash in the pan, if you like. But they also should promote the idea that we're going to sell high quality products at a decent price so that they can make a living and stay open in the high streets.
And Nick, that's the sort of attitude you come from, isn't it? You pride yourself in finding products to review that you know where it's coming from, and you spoke about the trend.
There's no doubt that it's a very pleasurable experience eating a great burger from a chef who's passionate about where his meat comes from. It's a lot of these.
In a paper bag.
Yeah, well, yeah, albeit without cutlery. Or I know some sorts of fellow panellists are a little cynical about this, but
I think the whole burger boom that's happened in London recently is a sort of it's a fad that is perfectly timed for the economic climate. It's cheap to buy, unlike reviewing steaks or complex things like fish. You don't need a lot of knowledge. It also ties into that kind of like Alabama barbecue, Southern American trashy San Diego, all that kind of vibe, that Americana basically.
But that's where we go back to, isn't it? It's that sort of reaction to the recession, the reaction to the austerity measures, but we still all want to go out and eat, or people still need to feed their kids. And some people lead very busy lives, which is where processed food has become a huge role in their lives. And I know that is a danger from Professor Lean's perspective because of the salt content, because of all the other things, and that sort of influence then on obesity.
It goes far further than just the salt content. We did an analysis of a large number of ready meals, popular ready meals from all the supermarkets. It was published last year. And the nutrient composition, all we have to go on is what they say is in them, are completely chaotic. They declare the nutrients as they're required to by law, but some of these meals contained the amount of salt that you should not eat in an entire day, and there they were in a single meal. Some of them had 3 times as much saturated fat as one would want to see in a meal for health. They simply haven't been thought about, and it doesn't take a lot of work to actually put the nutrients in the right order. And so ready meals have been generated for people on the move, for people in a hurry, for people who don't read the labels, for people who perhaps, who rely on somebody else to do it right for them, and they're not doing it right for them.
And that's where they've been let down.
They've been let down because the nutrients in ready meals have not been thought about nutritionally. That's why we spent the last year generating a nutritionally balanced ready meal. You probably know about it. It's a pizza. It's made by a company called Eat Balance, based in Glasgow, and it has all the nutrients that are required in the right proportions in a pizza, which is most people would think of as junk food. Right? It took us, academics and food producers, about a year to get it on the market, but it's now in in the supermarkets. It's in Asda, it's in Sainsbury, and it looks and tastes just like a pizza. So, that's an example of where we can put it right, and where the consumer can then rely on a ready meal actually being a meal, having the right number of calories, having the right amount of nutrients. Now then the consumer can trust a ready meal, as perhaps most Japanese ready meal eaters can.
Rob Lyons.
This is where I fundamentally disagree with Mike Lean about the supposed health dangers of processed food. The claims made numerous times about the dangers of salt or about saturated fat or fat in general. Over time, I looking into it myself, I've found that actually those claims do not stand up. And the idea that eating processed food, I mean, it might be packed with stodge or excess sugar or something, and maybe that's problematic. But for the most part, actually, processed food is perfectly good food.
Well, I have to tell you that you haven't analysed them properly. In that case, they are absolutely not. The food materials that go in, if they're put in the right proportions, could be. So the raw materials that go into processed foods are fine, but they're in the wrong proportions. They're made up by people who don't know what they're doing.
Can you illustrate exactly what you mean by that?
Well, I mean, you'd have to look at... we published a full paper last year which analysed, I think it was 71 ready meals, and showed that, exactly as I've explained, that some of them contained the amount of salt which would satisfy an entire family for a day.
All the claims about salt are greatly exaggerated.
They're not exaggerated.
They're greatly exaggerated. We have got bodies that have evolved over millions of years to finally regulate the amount of salt in our bodies and water in our bodies.
I can tell you about that. You have kidneys which are designed to get salt out of your body.
Yeah.
And that is what they do. They have a huge problem. Having moved out of an aquatic environment, our bodies need to get rid of salt. We evolved to avoid salt.
So we're very good at it, and that's why we do.
This is silly because this is a field
the link between salt and high blood pressure is actually pretty flimsy.
Somebody who doesn't know about it. So this is my professional field, and I do know this literature extremely well.
I know, and I've read the epidemiological papers on this stuff, and actually they found that actually doing population-wide reductions in salt actually will have very little effect on health.
You're completely incorrect on that, and sorry.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare, where we're discussing the latest horse meat scandal. I'm joined by Professor Mike Lean, Head of Human Nutrition at the University of Glasgow, Andrew Webb, a food journalist and editor of lovefood.com, Rob Lyons, Deputy Editor of Spiked and a food writer, and Nick Andrews, a burger lover, reviewer and blogger. Are we missing the other side of the argument, which, coming back to the horse meat in burgers or horse lasagna, or the fact that now horse carcasses have gone to Europe and have entered the food chain, and these carcasses have tested positive for the veterinary drug bute? I mean, isn't that then a greater danger to perception, health, trade, meat consumption?
The risk is clearly there. What we don't know is it's been assumed by the Chief Medical Officer that this is a dose issue, and I heard a reporter saying that you'd have to eat, bucket loads of burgers to get enough bute to do any damage. The aplastic anemia that develops if people are exposed to this is idiosyncratic. It doesn't depend on dose, and I don't want any of that stuff in my food.
Andrew?
I like to sort of get my crystal ball out now and try and gauge where this will end, because it's evolving and it changes every day, it seems. Sadly, we've been here with Sudan 1 and dioxin in pork and things like that. Food scares are nothing new. I actually think nothing much will change. There's been a lot of brouhaha. Everyone throws their arms in the air. There's masses of... No one will... I very much doubt we'll see anybody get fined. Trading standards often make great noise about taking the local kebab shop to pieces and finding this and finding them £10,000. The industry is so big, I think, that you're not going to see BP-style, Gulf fines. You're not going to see £1 billion fines, even though it's as serious as that. It's a pollution of the food chain. We're not going to see that, and I just think it's a crime. The whole thing's going to bloody blow over in 6 months' time, and it'll be someone else.
Is it wishful thinking then that this Horsegate becomes a watershed moment and people change the way they eat? People stop buying processed food, which you'd quite like, Professor Lean, and change their eating habits. What do you think, Nick?
Well, I think if you look at the American meatpacking industry example from the 80s and the 90s, where there was all sorts of E. coli and listeria getting in because of the way the abattoirs were rending carcasses, the only change that was made in spite of all the legislation, all the regulation that they tried to bring in, was when McDonald's said, we're not willing to have our customers eat meat of that low quality. So all their suppliers changed almost overnight to a much, much better and much cleaner and much safer system. And I actually think that whilst I don't think our eating habits will change that much, it will be when the big suppliers, the supermarkets, get their supply chains in order and say, this is not acceptable.
I think there's possibly a bit of a kind of tin helmet, keep your heads down kind of reaction to these things at the moment. There's probably like very little they can say that's going to do them any good. But I do think what the lesson that absolutely from a business point of view is it's your brand and you have to take responsibility for it. When you offer a brand, you're saying that this is going to have predictable quality, it's going to be of good quality. But if you don't follow through on that and make sure that you can back that claim up, then things like this are going to come and bite you on the bum. And that's exactly what's happened here. So I would expect either that we're going to see shorter supply chains and there's going to be more of an effort put into that by more suppliers, not just McDonald's and Morrison's, but other people as well, or they're going to be much stricter about testing the stuff that's floating around, because it has to be one or the other. And so I expect there will be some raising of standards on that kind of thing as a result of that, because otherwise, as people have already said, the biggest cost to these big companies will not be through fines, will not be through extra regulations. It will be through losing business because they've lost the trust in their brands.
We're going to see now. Mark Price at Waitrose says we're looking at 3 to 5% increase in the cost of food over the next couple of years. Will this have a knock-on the price of these things? Is it because are we going to now? Is the cost of this regulation and enforcement and all this sort of stuff going to be passed on to the consumer again? So food is going to go up. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Or we're just getting shafted by everybody, it seems.
And Professor Mike Lean, then, just finally, if you had a crystal ball, where do you think this is going to go?
I probably agree with the other commentators. I think the food industry is so big and so powerful that they will overwhelm governments, as they have done again and again and again. So I think they will find a solution which will look good. I think they're sort of ticking boxes. I think one of your other speakers mentioned this. I think that's the route they'll take, and it'll go down to testing and sampling. I do think that we'll see less horse in products, but they're very clever at dodging and weaving, and that'll probably go on forever.
Slightly depressing statement, I'd agree, but I'll end with Nick then from hamburgerme.com. What's next then? Horse burgers sold in newspaper?
Do you know what? I actually think a horse burger would be a terrible burger. Not because of the horse meat, but actually in a good burger, you've got a high fat content along with the meat. I don't think horse has enough fat in it to make a good burger patty.
Do you think then, Professor Lean, this is fraudulent criminal activity or really just a big old dupe from the supermarkets?
Clearly fraudulent, and there will clearly be convictions made, but I suspect that the big supermarkets won't be badly hit. I don't think they will be hit like BP, as you mentioned before.
Julia, I'll take you to dinner if somebody goes to prison over this.
You're on. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on The Voice of Russia. Professor Mike Lean, Head of Human Nutrition at the University of Glasgow. Andrew Webb, food journalist and editor of lovefood.com. Rob Lyons, Deputy Editor of Spiked and a food writer. And Nick Andrews, a burger lover, reviewer and blogger.
Normally buy and eat, the leftovers. They're, to some extent, industrial waste. And it's being sold again, sometimes at quite high prices. And the profit margins, though, in the food industry are all pretty low, and it's almost inevitable that someone somewhere will start to say, hello, I can chuck a bit of horse in here, or a bit of dog or cat or camel or badger or something, and get away with it, because it's very difficult for other people to recognize this. It's taken science to get to the point where we're doing DNA foods like orange juice internationally, or olive oil internationally, colossal problems with adulteration and fraud. The meat story is interesting because you can't really sell fresh meat because customers would see what it was, but you can sell processed meat. And if you can sell processed meat, then firstly you're selling meat that people wouldn't eat normally. It's usually very poor quality. So processed meat, things like sausages, pies, patties, generally are the parts of meat, parts of an animal, if you like, which you wouldn't.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Now, the horsemeat scandal runs on, and now the British government is criticising retailers for not telling consumers quickly enough about how much horsemeat is in their processed beef products. So is this a question of greedy supermarkets, or is it an international food mafia defrauding the world, selling beef that's actually horse? Joining the discussion is Professor Mike Lean, who's Head of Human Nutrition at the University of Glasgow and one of the world's leading nutritionalists. Andrew Webb is a food journalist and editor of lovefood.com. Rob Lyons is Deputy Editor of Spiked and a food writer. And Nick Andrews is a burger lover, reviewer and blogger for hamburgerme.com. First of all then, Professor Lean, is this a question of greedy supermarkets, or is there a bigger, wider issue of international fraud, which has meant that consumers in Britain no longer know whether it's horse lasagna or beef lasagna?
I mean, I think the food industry internationally, worldwide, has always been greedy when that industry has gone one step removed from the consumer. So if you have food made by a farmer and sold directly to a customer in the village, then you don't have a lot of capacity for fraud. There isn't much scope for fraud there. You can go back, hundreds of years. Fraudulent adulteration of foods of various kinds have hundreds of years of history. Milk was one of the earliest foods to be adulterated, just being watered down and sometimes coloured with chalk to be able to sell it at the price of milk when actually you're selling water. And the same applies to currently